think I'm actually going to title this video Message to the Province Level of the Canadian State in a Particular Province. Today is Wednesday, October 3, and I just wanted to talk about something that's happening in particular. I'm going to take off my glasses here. Something that is a very, very troubling practice in a province that in Canada that actually promotes itself as this multicultural diversity heartland of the world. And for someone who has grown up, for example, being exposed to the abuses that actually happen to the indigenous people in Canada from what they call the Plains territory of Canada, I learned a lot from that. How I became exposed to, this violence related to a lot of things related to hatred, colonization, and ideological deficits, is growing up in a particular area in the global north, in like prairie type place. I noticed that the treatment towards the indigenous people was just very strange, very cruel, very, very cruel. And as I was observing this as a person growing up, I just thought to myself, you know what, these people are pretty fucking ignorant. And so I remember I went through, it was 12 years, I think, 12 years of schooling. And, I only had one class out of 12 years, and I think it was maybe 10, 15 minutes. So just think, 15 minutes out of 12 years of schooling that actually spoke to a little bit of the problem with, for example, the treatment of Indigenous in Canada. And I remember the lesson that I received in that school environment was to just talk about how an Indigenous person of a mixed race, so it was Indigenous red mixed with Caucasian, so this mixed race person was actually hanged in Canada. And that's it. Didn't get any other information about, what happened with, for example, the red community in Canada, the real reds. And when I say red, I mean red such as in reference to persons before something called the Indian Act and persons before something called colonization. So I remember I was taking a course at this post-secondary place, and there was this really beautiful poem called Charlie, and it was actually written by an Indigenous author, and she's a professor now, but it was called Charlie, and by Lee Miracle. And there was a reference in there to something called residential school. And I read this poem and I thought to myself, what the hell is this thing called a residential school, right? And so it just sort of stuck in the back of my mind. And I was like, you know what? I need to find out more about this residential school thing because something is very strange here. And also growing up in a particular school system, there was a lot of strange things that happened in that school system where, for example, the techniques that are used to enrich the gifts in students are incredibly problematic, especially for persons like myself. So I remember that I was very curious about this thing called residential school because I was like, what the fuck is this thing, right? And so I was like, okay, where do I start learning about this? And I can't remember. I don't think I had the internet at the time. So I was like, okay, where do I start? And somehow I got connected back to what it was called was a Plains Indians Cultural Survival School. And first of all, I can't stand the word Indian because they're not from India. And so the Aboriginal community had this school, and it was the most beautiful place because you walk in and everything is your culture. All the teachers are indigenous. You have the elders. You have the traditional wares. So for people that are looking for their culture, they can walk into this place and say, "Oh my God, look at this!" Right? All the teachers are Aboriginal, and I thought it was the greatest place. So I met this one particular teacher, and I said to him, I said, I want to know more about this. I was reading a poem, and I want to learn more about this thing called residential school. I don't know what the hell this thing is, right? And he said, okay, I'll certainly show you what this residential school is. And you know what? After that experience, I was like, you see these motherfuckers? They're fucking sick. They're very, very sick. And so the residential school was basically a system that was actually created, it was imagined, and it was implemented. And it was a system of a type of abuse. But this abuse was very, very strategic, it was very orchestrated, and it was very deliberate. And it led to a lot of socialization mechanisms that actually taught kids to hate themselves, to be disconnected from their culture, even to try and tell a child that you can't speak your mother tongue, your indigenous tribal language, is so problematic. So I'm saying this to say there were some things that actually informed my position with respect to looking at sort of different things in life, looking at principles, and also responding to things that are just not right. So I relocated to another part in the global economic north just to, open up another chapter of my life. And, I was like, okay, I'm in a different place, and but what's going on here? And they have this practice, for example, where they target black women who are single. What they do is they separate black women from their children. So they take these children and they put them into these improper socialization environments. And when a person has their child taken away from them, it made me connect back to, for example, the experience of indigenous communities and indigenous mothers who went through this residential school experience, and made me begin to think, how could someone even do something like this? How could a system be engineered to do something like this? And in this particular province, for example, in the global economic north in a place in Canada, they promote themselves as this diversity heartland. So, for example, people who are abroad, that are looking to travel or whatever, they see a lot of stuff, for example, on the internet that says, oh, there's multiculturalism, there's diversity, but there's a lot of bullshit like this. And so I'm making this video to just send a message to, for example, a province level of the Canadian state. One of the things you need to do is you need to actually review this practice to take children away from good mothers. You don't even have any sense of care, any sense of sensitivity towards, for example, the implications of, number one, black women getting out of violent situations. Two, black women who have been socialized by an infrastructure that promotes the supremacy of whiteness. Three, you don't even think about the implications of the offspring of that black woman in terms of their ability to actually have a good life, free of bigotry, free of discrimination, and actually free of violence. And so what they have is they have this practice where, for example, if there's a black woman who's in distress, or a black woman who's having hard times, it's hard economic times, let's say, what they will do is they will separate the black woman from her child, just like they did in slavery. They raped black women, and then they took the children and they sold them. Look, what the fuck is this, people? Just like in the indigenous community. Indigenous women were raped, children were placed into these things, and you know what? The children were subject to all kinds of abuses, something called residential schools. So why has not the province level of the Canadian state actually learned from the history in Canada? Why? I'm in this, for example, a different province, and I'm like, do these people even know anything about the indigenous history in Canada? You should hear some of the comments about the indigenous community, and I realize there's some from the indigenous community that will look at me and call me nigger. But you know what? I understand something called the internalization of the supremacy of whiteness. How many people actually know about that? How many people have access to privileged information? That's not right. So I'm talking to different people about this, and I'm talking to like an indigenous, he's an elder in training. And I'm talking to other people and circles, networks, or whatever, reading text, watching films or whatever, just trying to understand this practice. And I've been observing some things in a particular province for at least 10 years. 10 years. It's like, why the fuck do these people even do this? Not one in that system has actually come forward and said, you know what, you guys, you need to fucking stop this. This is actually not benefiting them. They go on and on and on. So I'm making this video to say, you know what, to the province level of the Canadian state, you need to check what you're doing. You really do. Look at what you're doing to these women. These are smart women, very brilliant, very beautiful. You don't, I can't even find the right word. You don't bastardize these women. You don't even have a fucking sense of something called, it's a beautiful text out there, it's called Without Sanctuary. It's actually a picture essay book. And it talks about some of the things black folks went through. So you have, for example, this analysis, right? And this analysis has multiple dimensions that, for example, Dr. Patricia Hill Collins talks about in the Matrix of Domination. What exactly is a suppression? Well, you have ideological, which is number one. Then the next layer is operational, and then the actual outcome. That could be one conceptualization, or there's other conceptualizations. I'm saying this to say, even to, other people watching this or whatever, take a look at what they're doing in, at the province level of the Canadian state. The province level operates in such a way that it's incredibly problematic. And it's interesting because, for example, for some of you watching this that have no idea about how sort of the Canadian state is set up, there's different levels. So, for example, you have level number 1, level number 2, and then level number 3. And level number 3 is like, across the nation, international representation. Level number 2 is like basically the Canadian state was cut up like a pizza, so it would be one piece of a pizza. So they call that a province. And then you have level number 1 or level number 3, that is basically in, sort of cities and stuff. There's sort of the management of the city. And in this one urban demographic that prides itself as the most diverse city in the world, it is bullshit. That's bullshit. A lot of abuses. I see like the same thing, like I was just reflecting on sort of mechanisms of justice and judiciary and, stuff related to like human rights and, different things related to how do you actually restructure the structure. And I said to myself, I said, it's interesting because they have international mechanisms, but what is this thing happening at the province level? Because, for example, if someone is dehumanized through something that should not be happening, because, for example, the Constitution says so, then why has nobody from the province level of the Canadian state stepped back and said, wait a minute here, we need to assess all these models because something is not working here? And as a matter of fact, there is, like in this particular regional demographic, there's one governance party. And the governance is part of, it's an interactive way to actually get involved in, like, learning about policy, learning about, writing legislation, learning about, being a part of your social, making the social what you want it to be in terms of no violence. So, I'm just sharing this thought to say, people, start questioning what the fuck you're doing, okay? You take away, for example, children from good parents. That's not right. And then what you do is you throw them to the wolves, right? And then you have this like socialization system that's a bullshit system. The curriculum is a joke because the curriculum doesn't teach anything about, for example, critical analysis. So some people who benefit from, for example, the supremacy of whiteness can actually relate to this curriculum. They don't even do anything because it benefits them. And there's colored versions of the supremacy of whiteness. That's very, very important to know. And those colored versions are even worse because you know why? They should know better. They should know better. They're actually internalizing not only the supremacy of whiteness, but they're actually operationalizing that as well, which is even worse. So you have to get punitive with them. You gotta say, you know what, look at this this motherfucker. Look at this piece of shit. Look at this one in the black community. Look at this one in the Punjabi community. Look at this one in the China community. Look at even women. You have vaginas with penises. You have vaginas that actually are promoting this notion that, hey, women's rights and stuff, but you know what? They're doing the exact same thing that oppressed women. So then men, you have to look at this and say, look at this patriarchal vagina. And then you have a lot of complexities, right? So this is where black feminism comes in. Black feminism is ethics. It says, you know what? Look at all this bullshit. Look at all this bullshit. Has nothing to do with tearing down men. Has nothing to do with internalizing the supremacy of whiteness. Has nothing to do with operationalizing things, for example, in the text called without sanctuary. It doesn't have anything to do with that. It actually has something to do with reconstructing not only your sense of person, but a sense of ancestry, and also a sense of peace in social, in culture, in economic, and infrastructure, even environment, and additional. They have this practice to separate children from good mothers. And because this channel focuses on, for example, black issues, or the black shade. Why the fuck are they doing this to black women? It happens over and over and over. I've met so many sisters. And when they actually come forth to talk about their stories, it's fucking sad. It's fucking sad. It's not an American thing. It's a Canada thing. It's very sad. How did you lose your child? Oh, they just took my child away from me. They said, oh, criminalization, medicalization. So how do they assess your economic situation? How did they understand your positionality? So they created these data records. That's pretty interesting. So let's see if your signature and your commentary is on these data records. And then, you ask questions like this, right? To the province level of the Canadian state, you need to stop this shit. You need to really stop this shit. For other people watching my videos, take a look at what these motherfuckers do. And they go on and on and on and on. Not one of them have come forward and said, you know what? This is wrong, people. We need to stop this. Because you know what? They're going to take down the whole fucking place. And they're not going to take it down like these people who are blood-washed in violence. They're going to use their pen. They're going to take their pen, take the little pieces of paper, and write all this shit up. Canadian state from the province level. Province number 1. This thing that actually puts itself out there as the most diverse city in the world. You need to take a look at this shit. This shit is not funny. They separate good black women from their children. And then they put all these stories and stuff out there about the worst of the black elements. But they don't put anything out there about the good elements. They socialize, for example, people from the black community in these ways that reproduce something called the supremacy of whiteness. And it's not until you get into privileged circles that you begin to say, what the fuck is this thing called the supremacy of whiteness? Because we don't even begin to think like that. Remember, I read this poem called Charlie. And then I observed and I said, why are these people so cruel? They're calling the persons from the Aboriginal community these names. They even called me names as well. Called me nigger, called them squaw. I said, what the fuck is a squaw? They have names for everybody. But they don't even have a culture for themselves. But you also have an infiltration of that supremacy of whiteness into different colors. So for example, in the black community, you have these people that have straight hair, these people that have maybe lighter skin, people have refined features, they have code words in the black community. And they think that they're somehow superior to others. So they look at, for example, persons like myself. Natural, got locks. These are locks. I don't adopt any of the dirty ways of the fucking culture. The whiteness culture. And they look at us and they're like, oh wow, we gotta oppress them. Right? Let's get close to them. Let's find out who they are. And you know what? We are gonna try to do things to us, and then we say, okay, you know what? You need to back up your shit. Because they're looking at your stuff. And then you have these, dynamics, right? And it's really sad because when I come back to that poem, Charlie, I say, you know what? Look at what they did to the indigenous community. But then look at what they're doing to the black community. You have stuff happening to the black community. That's based on what happened to the indigenous community in Canada. That's not right, people. That's not right. And then you have all these other ethnicities. I mean, it's ridiculous. You even have for example, a Filipina who's colonized by something called Catholic faith. So they align with, for example, other people of that Catholic faith. And then they discriminate against people who identify with a different religion or no religion. I'm like, what the fuck is this, man? Like, I don't fucking care what your thing is, right? We'd like to actually go this way, so get the fuck out of our way. And some of them, they get very cheeky. They get real bold. So you gotta get bold with them. You gotta spit in their face. But not in their way. You take your pen, you sit down, study these people. The supremacy of whiteness is not a nice thing. And to those watching who understand this completely and are coming from, an anti-oppression perspective, that actually has to be operationalized as well. Because there's a lot of people that say, oh, well, I practice anti-oppression, but they don't operationalize it, right? I'm a conscious person because I don't believe in violence, and you know what, but I don't believe in sharing. But if you don't believe in sharing, then you know what, you're part of the violence. And then you have like these discussions or whatever, and then you have these violences. So the whole point of my video is just to say, you know what, check what you're doing, man, check what you're doing. Women as well. You don't take children away from black women. Good black women. And I'm starting from, for example, black women. I know that there's good black men who are single parents. I mean, that's a whole other video. I have to, conceptualize it. Single black males that love black women. You guys are very good. You're very, very good. They have this practice, for example, there's a case, a lawsuit that happened in the 1970s. And it was in Canada where, for example, this black male he was fighting for, it was a black on black situation. He was fighting for custody of his children. And what the Canadian state did in the 70s was they said, okay, he can't get the children because he is not female. I'm sorry, people, you know what that is? That's gender discrimination against black men. And then there's different levels to that have to be assessed according to something such as, and could be others, the Matrix of Domination. Gender discrimination against black men. So then we come into these situations and then we're saying, okay, what exactly happened to the kids? All of them, except for one, has been socialized to hate themselves. No economic stability. There's reproduction of colonization residue. There's the internalization of whiteness. So these have to actually be written in data records. Where exactly are they in the data records? Right? And then you get into situations called case processing. Case processing is supposed to set social norms. What exactly are these fucking social norms? People, check what you're doing, please. This shit ain't funny. Unemployment, dead children, broken black families, broken black relationships, the internalizing of whiteness. What the fuck is that? And then you actually take away children from good black mothers? What the fuck is that? And you criminalize them, you medicalize them, you degrade them, and you dehumanization them. What the fuck is that? For those beacons watching this, thank you. You know what? Take a look at these things called data records. How do people actually consent to these things? They go on and on and on. So how can you smile with these people? I don't smile with them. I say, what the fuck is this, man? What the fuck is this? Someone's trying to get on with their fucking life. So you know what you say? Okay, you know what? 100%. You start talking in percentage points. You want to find out what is the value of their net worth, starting with that. 100%. I need 100% of that back. Because that's taking responsibility. That's being